Hello and welcome to StratNews Global. I'm Parul Chandra, and with me today is the former Indian ambassador to Nepal, Mr. Ranjit Rae, and he's here to talk to us about the upcoming visit of the Nepalese foreign minister to India. He'll also be talking to us about India Nepal bilateral relations as well as the current political turmoil in Nepal. Welcome to StratNews Global, Mr. Rae. Pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you.
Now, my first question to you, of course, is that the Nepalese Foreign Minister Pradeep Gayawali will be in New Delhi soon. And this visit is for participation in the joint commission meeting that is on, a regular mechanism between the two countries. But there is really much more significance to this meeting because it's the first high level visit from Nepal after India Nepal ties turned frosty over the map row. And he's also coming at a time when there's political turmoil in Nepal. So, how do you see this visit?
Well, any visit by a Nepalese dignitary is certainly very important because Nepal is a very important partner for India. India-Nepal relations are critical for both countries. After all, it's a neighboring country. And, our government has the neighborhood first policy. But Nepal-India relations, especially during last year, as you said, have been quite frost over the publication of a new map by the Nepalese government, which incorporates several Indian territories. And after that, there was a long gap in engagement between the two countries. And there was a feeling in India that it's really not advantageous either for Nepal or India to allow this long gap to continue. So we had a series of visitors from India, including our foreign secretary, at least to get our bilateral cooperation projects going. So it's in that context, I think that the visit of the Nepalese foreign minister is important because the Joint Commission really looks at the entire gamut of relationships, between the two countries, whether it's political, economic, cultural, and provides direction, to the diplomats and to the governments in terms of future course of action. Of course, this visit is happening at a time of great turmoil in Nepal. But I do believe that we have to deal with the government of the day and get our bilateral cooperation moving, irrespective of what's happening domestically.
Now, this, as you said, that the visit is taking place at a time of great political turmoil in Nepal, and now Nepal is headed for elections in late April, May. So, given that the country is headed for elections, do we see the bilateral relations going forward from here? Does it depend on the continuance of Prime Minister Oli as the Prime Minister, or will it be the same if somebody else becomes the Prime Minister?
So, as I said, we have to deal with whichever government is in power in Nepal. And one doesn't really know what the outcome of the elections will be. In fact, I'm somewhat skeptical as to whether elections actually will be held. So there is a lot of things that are to happen between now and the elections. And the most important of which, of course, is how the Supreme Court will look at the dissolution of the lower house of parliament by Prime Minister Oli. My sense from reading the Nepalese constitution and from what various constitutional experts are saying is that, there really is no provision in the Nepalese constitution for the Prime Minister to dissolve the House. And the reason for this is that, historically, there's been a lot of political instability in Nepal. Governments have changed every year or every few months. And that's why the new constitution actually has very stringent protections in order to provide for stability. For instance, you cannot have a no confidence motion against the prime minister without giving an alternative name. And similarly, the house cannot be dissolved at will. There are a series of stages that have to be undergone before the house is dissolved, and every possibility of forming an alternative government has to be explored. Now, in this particular case, the Prime Minister of Nepal has really dissolved the House simply because he had lost the confidence of his own party. and hence he had lost his majority. So, in order to save his position, he has dissolved the House. So, this is a very serious matter, and let's see how the Supreme Court decides. But already there's a lot of turmoil in Nepal. Huge protests are taking place throughout the country. This decision of the president, which has been supported by this decision by the prime minister, which has been supported by the president, I think has long-term implications for the future stability in Nepal.
You mentioned that Prime Minister Oli went ahead and dissolved Parliament despite the Constitution not allowing it. Now there is also speculation that the elections may not just even be held on time, and Prime Minister Oli, if he wants to hold on to power and if he senses defeat in the upcoming polls, could actually just not hold elections. Is that a possibility?
It's certainly a possibility. So first, you have to wait for the Supreme Court judgment. Suppose the Supreme Court invalidates the Prime Minister this decision, and the House is reconvened. Now, in that case, Prime Minister Oli would have lost his majority. So he would either need to find new alliance partners, which is possible, with the opposition party, which is the Nepali Congress, and the Janta Samajwadi Party, the two parties in opposition. So he might try and cobble together this coalition. Alternatively, he may be forced to resign if he doesn't have a majority. There could be another coalition between the Madhav Nepal Prachand faction of the Nepal Communist Party and the Congress. So, that is one possibility. The second possibility, of course, is that if the Supreme Court validates the Prime Minister's decision and decides that the dissolution is constitutional, so in that case, I foresee that the present protests that are happening will increase. So there would be turmoil in the Nepalese street. Already Nepal has suffered a lot under the COVID pandemic and its economic after effects. And there have been a lot of protests by various groups, some calling for a restoration of a Hindu state, others seeking a restoration of the monarchy. Now the mainstream political parties are agitating against the dissolution of the House. So I foresee this turmoil increasing. And if you go by past experience in Nepal, this could then be we don't know where this will lead. If the turmoil increases on the street, how will the security forces react? What will the government do? There are, several options available. So whether in this kind of scenario, elections can be held, because, Prime Minister has really decided or announced the date for holding elections. In fact, this is also controversial because, the Election Commission normally announces the dates. But the Prime Minister has announced dates quite far away in the future, just before the 6-month period ends. So why has he given this very long time frame? He could have announced elections, say, 2 months down the road, but he hasn't done that. So I think all this leads to some suspicion in the minds of people as to, whether elections will be held. I think a lot will depend basically on how the situation unfolds between now and the proposed date for the elections.
So many question marks on Prime Minister Oli's conduct in this whole issue of dissolution of parliament and calling of elections. Would you say that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think he has basically followed, a tactical approach of, taking a major decision simply to save his own position. So certainly there are very major question marks on his conduct, and not only his conduct, but he has been supported by the president of Nepal in this decision.
Now, my next question to you is: what impact will prolonged instability or political turmoil in Nepal have on India?
So I think India's long-term strategy and interest lies in a stable Nepal. We have seen that whenever Nepal is unstable, whether it was during the Maoist insurgency, whether it was during the Madhesi agitations, so Nepal becomes very vulnerable to inimical forces, forces that are inimical to Nepal's own interests and India's interests. Don't forget in 1999, we had the hijacking of IC-814 to Kandahar. And that was in the middle of this, whole Maoist insurgency. So I think an instability in Nepal makes it more vulnerable to such negative influences. And since we have a long border, we have an open border, very close relationship with Nepal, I think this has huge negative security implications for us, and also in terms of our whole development partnership. If there's political instability in Nepal, then, the big projects we are talking about, whether in the field of hydropower or in other areas, obviously get impacted. So, I think this kind of turmoil will certainly negatively impact on both Nepal's interests and India's interests.
Ambassador Rai, there is also a perception that the Nepalese political leadership, and I'm not only talking about Prime Minister Oli, but Prachanda or Madhav Kumar Nepal, or even former Prime Minister Duba of the Nepali Congress, they're all driven by self-interest rather than the interest of Nepal when it comes to their political, conduct. What would be your response to that?
I also personally feel that Nepalese politics tends to be very tactical, and everybody is looking for their own immediate interest, and in the process, sometimes the national interest suffers. But this is really not for me to say about the Nepalese leadership and the politicians.
Yes.
It's really for the people of Nepal to decide. But, in this particular instance, for instance, dissolution of the House is such a major step. And this is a new constitution. And, as Dr. Ambedkar had said, that the constitution is really as good as the people who implement it. So if those that implement it themselves are not totally committed to it, then, it's very difficult to see what will happen in the future.
Now, Parliament's dissolution in Nepal has come just when India-Nepal ties were getting back on track, and now that the foreign minister is going to be coming here, just days ahead of his visit, Prime Minister Oli has yet again said that he will retrieve the territories of Kalapani, Lipu Lake, and Limpiodhara, over which there is a dispute with India, and which actually led to the frostiness in ties that had set in. Now, do you see this issue being resolved? How can the two sides resolve this issue?
Well, the only way of resolving it is through dialogue and negotiation. And I think at some stage we'll have to start doing that. And, frankly, we are on very solid ground. And I don't really think Nepal has any case at all, if you look at historical records. But, these are very emotional matters. And there is a lot of, high decibel rhetoric on this in Nepal. So it will be a long, drawn-out process. But, we have to start somewhere, maybe with the technical working groups of the surveyors, and then, meetings at the surveyor general's level, and then, political discussions at the level of the foreign secretaries. So I think the Nepalese are very keen that, at least a dialogue process should begin. And I also personally feel then, rather than allowing these irritants to, assume a life of their own, we also should, seriously try and resolve these issues.
Could India have prevented ties dipping to such a low if India had agreed to Nepal's demand for talks at the foreign secretary level on the Kalapani dispute?
I really don't think so. I think India somehow always gets drawn into the domestic politics of Nepal. And, there is a very strong undercurrent of anti-Indian sentiment in Nepal. And, Nepali nationalism, in fact, is based on a lot of this, flagging this anti-India sentiment. So this is what Prime Minister Oli was doing when he felt threatened within his party, by the other leaders. So he thought he could whip up nationalist sentiment by really, raising the profile of the boundary issue. And this is precisely what he did. Of course, it didn't really help him in terms of his own position within the party. So this is something we've seen time and again. And Prime Minister Oli, of course, is a master at using this
Yes.
anti-India sentiment. He won the whole election on the basis of so-called standing up to India and to bullying by India. So this is something that happens constantly, and I don't really think India is responsible for the dip in ties. Having said that, I do feel that we should not allow too long gaps to develop in our bilateral engagement. I think last year what happened was that since Nepal was in political turmoil and there was a lot of speculation in terms of what will happen, whether there will be leadership change, etc. So I think the government of India was waiting and watching to see if the
Mhm.
situation stabilizes. But this instability continued and it is still continuing. So I think, on balance, the decision is a wise one that at least our bilateral engagement should continue and not be held hostage to what is happening domestically in Nepal.
And now, India has often been accused of meddling in Nepal's domestic politics. But during this current ongoing political turmoil in Nepal, it was China which was overtly seen as interfering in the political developments. You had a high level delegation from the Chinese Communist Party that came to Kathmandu in late December, held meetings with Prime Minister Oli and other leaders. How do you see this Chinese interference in Nepal?
So this is a new development. I mean, China has been involved in Nepal. In the past, they really dealt with the government of the day. But with multi-party democracy, and especially Nepal becoming a republic, I think the Chinese have expanded their engagement with various political parties. Uh, and they used to focus largely on their economic
Hmm.
cooperation and development-oriented projects. But I think over the last 1 or 2 years, we see a change in the approach of the Chinese. And they are now getting much more involved in the domestic politics of Nepal, and particularly within the Nepal Communist Party. Prior to the visit of President Xi Jinping in November of last year, there was a big visit by the Chinese Communist Party a month before that. Various agreements were signed to strengthen cooperation between the Chinese Communist Party and the Nepalese Communist Party. And there's been a lot of engagement at the party to party level,
Hmm.
including training of Nepalese communist cadres on Xi Jinping thought. So,
Hmm.
and we know that the Chinese ambassador was very active in trying to, get the unification of the two parties of the erstwhile UML and the Maoists into one party, and they had succeeded. And here again, following the dissolution of the lower house, we had a big Chinese delegation. So the Chinese
Yes.
engagement now in domestic political matters in Nepal is very open and visible. It's very public and it's very intrusive. And I think there will be a pushback against this in Nepal. But the Chinese are here to stay,
Mhm.
and I only see their role and presence expanding, and that is something India will naturally have to factor in to its own decision making and policy making vis-a-vis
Mhm.
Nepal.
My final question to you going forward, how do you see India Nepal relations panning out, say, if a new government, whenever a new government uh, comes into power? And secondly, how do you see India dealing with this growing Chinese influence in Nepal?
So it's very difficult to predict what will happen in the long term, but I think we should be clear about our objectives. Our objective
Mhm.
should be to have peace and stability in Nepal. It should be to support the democratic aspirations of the people of Nepal. And, we should be on the
Mhm.
side of the people of Nepal. That really should be our long term objective, I think, in Nepal. And that should really influence the policy approaches and actions that we undertake. Of course, the problem is that, we are also very concerned about growing Chinese presence.
Yes.
And I think we have to create a new toolbook in terms of how we are going to deal with the growing Chinese presence, and especially in internal affairs of Nepal. Uh, you know, I think we have to really step up our engagement in Nepal with all political leaders, all political parties, all factions within political parties. I think this is very, very important. We cannot have a hands-off approach on Nepal. Secondly, I think our projects have to be speeded up. The implementation is very, very critical. And third, I think we also have to engage with like-minded countries and share assessments about what's happening. And lastly, of course, our relations with China, India-China relations are at a very difficult phase, and especially with the problems in Ladakh. But at some stage, I think we have to start engaging with China in terms of what's happening in our neighborhood, how they look at Nepal, what their objectives in Nepal are. I think it's important, to try and understand where each of us is coming from. And, this will, create, I think, a better situation. But right now, of course, it's very difficult, given the deep trough that India-China relations are in. But I think in the long term, we have to look at some of these options.
Yeah, so perhaps, for India, kind of a difficult dealing with the growing presence of China in India's neighborhood.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So we really have to develop a toolkit to handle this.
Yeah. On that note, thank you so much for talking to StratNews Global, Mr. Rae. Pleasure having you with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.